Right now, the world's most important waterway is sitting under a field of up to 6,000 naval mines, and a US Navy that has never faced a mine-clearing challenge of this scale in the modern era is being sent in to deal with it. That's not a headline exaggerating for clicks, that is the actual situation as of this week in the Strait of Hormuz. And what makes this moment so extraordinary, so genuinely unprecedented in its implications, is not just the military dimension. It's that this crisis cuts right through the throat of the global economy, directly into the pocket of every American who fills a gas tank, buys groceries, or has any kind of retirement savings. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles. And through that 21-mile gap, roughly one-fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas has historically flowed every single day. Since late February of 2026, when the United States and Israel launched an air campaign against Iran and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, that flow has been essentially shut off. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps sealed it, mined it, tolled it, and turned it into the most consequential geopolitical pressure point on the planet. Now let's talk about what is really happening here, because the picture is far more complicated and far more dangerous than what the cable news cycle is giving you. When the war against Iran began on February 28th of this year, the IRGC moved with a speed that caught a lot of Western analysts off guard. They began issuing radio transmissions forbidding passage through the strait almost immediately. Within days, they had formally closed it. Major shipping firms, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits through the strait and related routes such as the Red Sea. Think about what that means in practical terms. These are not small operators. These are the companies that move the physical goods of the global economy. When they stop, the world stops getting things. And what followed was not a temporary hiccup, it was a systemic shock. Following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz in early March, Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel, and Qatar Energy was forced to declare force majeure on all exports. And the ripples did not stop at energy markets. The oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by mid-March, reaching at least 10 million barrels per day by the 12th of March. The maritime blockade triggered what analysts were calling a grocery supply emergency across Gulf states, with over 70% of the region's food imports disrupted and retailers forced to airlift basic staples, resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. Now here's the part that hits home for Americans specifically. Petrol prices in the United States rose to an average of $4.11 per gallon, up from $2.98 on February 28th when the war began. And economists were already warning that if oil prices stayed elevated, the economic consequences would be severe. According to one professor of international business at American University, for every $10 of sustained increase in oil prices per barrel, we should expect a decrease in GDP growth of about 0.4%, meaning a sustained $60 increase above the average would push the US firmly into recession territory. We need to sit with that number for a moment. That's not a fringe view. That's a calibrated economic statement from someone who studies this for a living. And at the time of that statement, oil was approaching exactly that kind of elevation. So this is the backdrop against which Trump made his announcements this past weekend. After 21 hours of negotiations in Islamabad that ultimately collapsed, J.D. Vance announced that Iran had chosen the pursuit of a nuclear weapon over peace. Trump went on Truth Social and declared a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The language he used was dramatic. He called Iran's behavior world extortion. He said he instructed the Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran, and that the US would begin destroying the mines the Iranians laid in the straits. Now, let's talk about those mines, because this is where the story gets technically terrifying in a way that most people don't fully appreciate. Iran's stockpile is estimated by maritime analysts to number between 2,000 and 6,000 mines, a significant portion of which are produced domestically. And these are not the crude floating mines of the World War II era, though Iran does have those too. They have contact mines, influence mines that respond to a ship's magnetic signature, acoustic profile, or pressure changes, and what are known as rising mines, weapons that sit dormant on the seafloor and activate when triggered by the passage of a vessel overhead. As analysts put it, a mined area does not have to be everywhere in the minds of those who must transit it. That's the genius of the mine as a weapon. Its psychological power dwarfs its physical footprint. And then there is this Extraordinary detail that came out just before the Islamabad talks fell apart. Iran reportedly lost track of its own naval mines deployed in the Strait of Hormuz. The country mined the strait haphazardly, did not systematically track placements, and in some cases deployed them in ways that caused them to drift away from their original positions. Let that land. Iran essentially scattered potentially thousands of weapons of war across one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth, and then lost track of where some of them went. This is not a rhetorical flourish. This is what US officials were telling reporters, and it means that even if a diplomatic deal was struck tomorrow, the physical reopening of the strait would still require an enormous, dangerous, and time-consuming mine clearance operation because the Iranians themselves cannot tell anyone where all the mines are. The United States destroyed 10 inactive mine-laying boats in the early stages of the conflict, and CENTCOM released video footage of strikes against Iranian naval vessels, including 16 mine layers near the Strait of Hormuz. But the mine-laying capacity of Iran was never exclusively concentrated in large ships. Iran can deploy naval mines from land using rocket systems demonstrated on Iranian state television that can launch potentially hundreds of mines into the water in a very short period of time. Small boats, rockets from the coast, submersibles. The Iranian asymmetric toolkit for mining a strait was never going to be defeated simply by sinking a fleet of surface vessels. Now here's where I want to step back and look at the bigger picture, because the military drama tends to draw all the attention and people miss the deeper structural story. What is actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a confrontation between the United States and Iran. It is a crystallization of every tension that has been building in the global order for the last decade: the erosion of American unipolarity, the rise of China as an alternative power center, the fragility of the dollar-denominated oil trade, and the limits of military force as a tool of economic coercion. Consider China's position. China relies on the Strait of Hormuz for approximately 90% of its energy imports. Think about what that means for Beijing's calculations. Every day that the strait stays closed or restricted, China is watching its energy security degrade. Trump, recognizing this leverage, has been pressuring Beijing to help force the strait open, even suggesting that a summit with Xi Jinping could be at risk if China doesn't act. But China's response has been instructive. Rather than bending to American pressure and helping enforce a blockade against Iran, a country with which China has deep economic and strategic ties, Beijing and Moscow together blocked a UN Security Council resolution aimed at protecting commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz on April 7th, with Russia and China calling it biased against Iran. And then, in what is either a remarkable coincidence or a calculated strategic mirror image, while US efforts were occurring to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, China moved to block the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. The message embedded in that action is not subtle. If the United States is going to use military force and economic pressure to control a waterway that matters to Chinese energy security, Beijing is going to demonstrate that it too has the ability to close choke points that matter to American strategic interests. This is the world we're living in right now. It's not a post-Cold War world where American power simply flows unopposed. It's a world where every major power is drawing red lines and signaling that it will respond in kind to any move it perceives as hostile. Now let's talk about the American domestic dimension, because this is a war that Trump began and now has to finish, and the political and economic clock is ticking. Brent crude rose 7% to $100 a barrel on Monday, a gain of 40% since the start of the war. WTI, the US benchmark, climbed by 7.8% to $104 a barrel, more than 50% higher than before the war effectively shuttered the Strait of Hormuz. And the International Monetary Fund, which does not typically traffic in alarmism, has cut its global growth forecast significantly. Global inflation is now forecast at 4.4%, up 0.6 percentage points, driven by surging oil, gas, and fertilizer costs. The IMF also cut GDP growth forecasts for the entire Middle East and North Africa region, while the Eurozone is also slowing. The economic damage is already real. It is already spreading, and it is already being felt by ordinary Americans at the gas pump and in grocery stores. Iran's parliamentary speaker chose a particularly pointed way to frame the US blockade announcement. He said on social media that the so-called blockade would soon make Americans nostalgic for $4 or $5 gas. That's a political taunt, yes, but it's a taunt grounded in economic reality. Because if the blockade succeeds in strangling Iranian oil exports, it also tightens global supply further, which pushes prices higher for everyone, including Americans. The paradox of the blockade is built into its own logic. Cutting off Iran's oil revenues hurts Iran. But cutting off global oil supply also hurts the American consumer, the American economy, and Trump's own political standing. And then there is the mine-clearing operation itself. The Navy has already sent guided missile destroyers into the strait to begin what CENTCOM called setting the conditions for clearing mines. Two U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, crossed through the Strait of Hormuz as part of a broader mission to ensure the strait is fully clear of sea mines previously laid by Iran's IRGC. But experts are cautioning that the U.S. is not particularly well positioned for this specific task. Analysts said Washington may have to look outside its own ranks to get a thorough sweeping of mines in the Strait of Hormuz, noting that this is an area in which the U.S. Navy would probably rely on allies and partners more than one would assume. And here the story gets uncomfortable for the White House. Four decommissioned Avenger-class mine countermeasures ships left Bahrain in January, handing over their countermine mission to Independence-class littoral combat ships, vessels that are significantly less specialized for this kind of work. The timing of that decommissioning and the capability gap it has created is something that the military establishment is quietly grappling with right now. The coalition picture is also fractured in ways that reveal the limits of American diplomatic authority in this moment. Trump said the UK was sending minesweepers. The UK almost immediately clarified that it would not be joining the blockade. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said his focus was to keep the waterway open through diplomacy, minesweeping, and marshalling international cooperation, but explicitly not through joining Trump's blockade of Iranian ports. French President Emmanuel Macron said France and Britain would co-organize a conference of countries prepared to contribute to a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation. So even America's closest traditional allies are carving out their own lane, one that involves minesweeping and diplomacy, rather than a confrontational blockade that many analysts view as a potential act of war in international legal terms. Iran's own response to the blockade announcement has been defiant and measured in equal parts. On the one hand, Iranian officials have called the blockade a bluff. Iran's parliamentary spokesperson for the National Security Commission wrote on social media that the blockade announcement was bluff rather than reality, warning that such a move would be considered an act of war and that Iran would respond, potentially revealing other strategic cards not yet played. On the other hand, the IRGC Navy declared that any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would face a severe response. Both messages being sent simultaneously. You're bluffing, but also if you're not bluffing, there will be war. That's a message designed to create maximum uncertainty in the minds of American planners. And underneath all of this, there is the deepest question of all, the one that rarely gets asked in the cable news loop. How did the United States end up here? How did the most powerful military in human history end up in a situation where a country with a fraction of its military budget has successfully closed the world's most important energy choke point for weeks, is charging ships $1 million per transit, has scattered thousands of naval mines across a waterway that it is now legally obligated under international norms to help clean up, and is also apparently losing track of where some of those mines are? The answer to that question is not comfortable, and it does not fit into a 3-minute cable segment. It involves decades of policy choices, the limits of air power as a tool for achieving political objectives, the underestimation of Iranian strategic patience and asymmetric capability, and the overconfidence that comes from decades of being the world's unchallenged dominant power. What we are watching in the Strait of Hormuz right now is a live stress test of American power in the 21st century. It is a test of whether military dominance can actually translate into political outcomes in a world where adversaries have learned, very deliberately, to fight in the spaces where American conventional superiority provides the least advantage. Mines are cheap. Sophisticated modern mines can be manufactured for tens of thousands of dollars, yet they can impose economic and strategic costs that are orders of magnitude higher. The cost asymmetry is breathtaking. Iran has potentially spent a few $100 million worth of mines to impose hundreds of billions of dollars of economic disruption on the global economy. That's not a failure of Iranian strategy. That is Iranian strategy working exactly as designed. And Trump now has to figure out how to extract the United States from this situation in a way that doesn't look like defeat, doesn't blow up the global economy further, doesn't spark a broader war with a nuclear threshold state, and doesn't antagonize China into closing the South China Sea as a countermeasure. That is an extraordinarily difficult set of simultaneous objectives to achieve. The blockade is a pressure tool, but pressure cuts both ways. Every day oil stays above $100 a barrel, every day gas prices stay above $4, every day the American consumer feels the pinch, the political cost of this war grows for the administration, and Trump, whatever else you say about him, understands political costs. The Islamabad talks failing was not just a diplomatic setback. It was a signal that the gap between what the US demands, Iranian denuclearization and an open strait, and what Iran is willing to concede, control over its own nuclear program as its last major deterrent, may be unbridgeable through negotiation alone. That leaves force, which carries enormous escalation risk, or a prolonged standoff, which carries enormous economic risk. There is no clean exit from this situation, and the 6,000 mines sitting at the bottom of the most important 21 miles of water on Earth are not going anywhere quickly, no matter who wins the next round of political posturing.